we often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1889 and the solemn story of James Maybrick. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best as it can be told. In Aigburth, a prosperous suburb of Liverpool, stood an imposing residence known as Battle Crease House. It was the home of James Maybrick, a 50-year-old cotton merchant who had built a considerable fortune through his business in both Britain and the United States. His wife was the much younger Florence, an American belle from Mobile, Alabama, whom he had married in 1881. To the outside world, they were the picture of late Victorian affluence and respectability. They had 2 young children, a grand home, and a full staff of servants. But behind the heavy curtains of Battle Crease House, the marriage was a brittle facade, strained by a significant age gap, cultural differences, and a web of secrets and resentments that would soon erupt into a national scandal. The private reality of the Maybrick marriage was one of deep unhappiness. James Maybrick was a known hypochondriac, obsessed with his health and possessed of a perilous faith in the patent medicines of the day. He regularly dosed himself with a variety of tonics and self-prescribed remedies, many of which were little more than poisons sold over the counter. He had a long-established habit of consuming arsenic and strychnine, believing them to be aphrodisiacs and stimulants. This chronic self-poisoning made him irritable and prone to violent mood swings. Trapped in a lonely marriage and living in a foreign country, the 26-year-old Florence sought affection elsewhere. She began a discreet affair with a family friend, a businessman named Alfred Brierly. But in the rigid and unforgiving society of Victorian England, secrecy was a fragile shield. When James discovered his wife's infidelity, the simmering toxicity in their home, both metaphorical and literal, was set to boil over. In the spring of 1889, 2 seemingly unrelated events set the stage for the tragedy. In March, Florence Maybrick went to a local chemist's shop and purchased a quantity of flypaper. The sticky sheets were a common household item used to catch flies, but they were also known to be coated with a significant amount of arsenic. A simple soak in water could easily extract the poison. Around the same time, in late March, James and Florence attended the Grand National Horse Race. There, a bitter argument erupted, purportedly over Florence's debts or her relationship with Brierly. The quarrel escalated into a public scene and continued back at Battle Crease House, where James, in a fit of rage, physically assaulted his wife. In the immediate aftermath of this confrontation, James Maybrick fell violently ill. It was the beginning of a mysterious sickness from which he would never recover. From the end of April into early May, James Maybrick's health rapidly deteriorated. He suffered from excruciating stomach pains, relentless nausea, and severe diarrhea. His local doctor was cold, but was baffled by the array of symptoms, initially diagnosing the condition as acute dyspepsia or indigestion. As James's condition worsened, more doctors were consulted, but none could agree on a cause. The patient himself insisted his illness was the result of a bad batch of his usual medicines. During this time, James's brothers, Michael and Edwin, arrived at Battle Crease House. Deeply suspicious of their sister-in-law, they effectively took control of the household. They began to monitor who saw James and what he was given to eat and drink, increasingly marginalizing Florence from the care of her own husband. The atmosphere in the sick room grew thick with mistrust and accusation. On May 11, 1889, after weeks of agony, James Maybrick died. Even before James's death, suspicion had already fallen squarely on Florence. Her affair with Alfred Brierly was now an open secret among the family and servants. James's brothers intercepted a letter Florence had written to her lover, which seemed to confirm their worst fears. The most damning event, however, occurred on the night of May 8th. A nurse hired to care for James, a woman named Alice Gore, observed Florence acting strangely with a bottle of Valentine's meat juice, a beef extract often given to invalids. The nurse watched as Florence took the bottle into a darkened room. When she retrieved it later, she noticed it was heavy with a powdery sediment. The bottle was put aside and handed over to Michael Maybrick. This single act, witnessed by a servant, would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It was presented as clear evidence of a wife secretly administering poison to her ailing husband under the cover of darkness. Immediately following James Maybrick's death, his brothers demanded a full post-mortem examination. The results confirmed their suspicions. Traces of arsenic were found in James's liver, kidneys, and intestines. Though the amount was small, it was enough for the authorities to act. An inquest was held, and based on the discovery of the poison, the testimony of the servants about the fly papers, and the incident with the meat juice, the coroner's jury concluded that James Maybrick had been murdered. Florence Maybrick was formally charged and arrested. The case became an immediate sensation. The story of the beautiful young American socialite accused of poisoning her wealthy British husband captivated the public on both sides of the Atlantic. Newspapers printed every salacious detail, portraying Florence as either a cold, calculating killer or a tragic victim of circumstance, depending on the publication. The trial of Florence Maybrick began in Liverpool in July 1889 and was one of the most widely reported legal battles of its era. The prosecution, led by the Attorney General himself, built a powerful circumstantial case. They presented Florence's affair with Alfred Brierly as the motive, a desire to be free of her husband, to be with her lover. For the means, they pointed to her purchase of the arsenic-laced fly papers. They argued that she had systematically poisoned her husband over a period of weeks, culminating in the incident with the meat juice. The defense mounted a robust counter-argument. They produced numerous witnesses who testified to James Maybrick's long-standing habit of consuming arsenic, a practice known as arsenic-eating. They argued that he was, in essence, an arsenic addict and had likely died from an accidental overdose of his own dangerous medicines. They contended that the small amount of arsenic found in his body was consistent with his regular use and was not enough to constitute a fatal dose. Florence herself claimed she had used the fly paper solution to create a cosmetic face wash, a known, if risky, beauty treatment of the time. The fate of Florence Maybrick ultimately rested in the hands of the judge, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, a brilliant but ailing jurist whose health was in decline. His summing up to the jury became one of the most controversial in British legal history. Over several hours, he delivered a rambling and deeply biased speech that focused less on the conflicting scientific evidence and more on a moral condemnation of Florence's character. He repeatedly emphasized her adultery, referring to it as a disgusting and revolting story, and strongly implying that a woman capable of such a moral transgression was undoubtedly capable of murder. He largely dismissed the defense's compelling evidence about James's arsenic-eating habit. Influenced by this powerful judicial instruction, the jury deliberated for just over half an hour. They returned with a verdict: guilty. The judge, weeping, donned the black cap and sentenced Florence to be hanged.
The verdict and death sentence sent a shockwave of protest across Britain and the United States. Many felt that Florence Maybrick had been convicted not of murder, but of adultery. The press, which had been divided, now largely turned in her favor, savaging the judge's biased summing up and questioning the strength of the evidence. A powerful movement for a reprieve began, with thousands of people signing petitions. Prominent figures, including politicians and legal scholars, publicly called for a review of the case. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, found himself under immense political pressure. He conducted a review and concluded that while there was evidence Florence had administered arsenic with intent to murder, there was reasonable doubt as to whether the arsenic had actually been the cause of her husband's death. It was a strange and logically inconsistent finding, but it was enough. Less than 3 weeks after being sentenced to death, Florence's sentence was officially commuted to penal servitude for life. Florence Maybrick spent the next 15 years in prison, first at Woking and later at Aylesbury. She was released on parole in January 1904. After her release, she struggled to rebuild her life. She wrote a book about her ordeal, titled Mrs. Maybrick's Own Story, My 15 Lost Years. She eventually returned to the United States, but lived a reclusive and impoverished life, constantly moving to avoid public attention. She died alone in a small cottage in Connecticut in 1941. The question of her guilt remains a subject of intense debate to this day. Was she a cold-blooded poisoner, or the victim of a miscarriage of justice condemned by Victorian moral hypocrisy? Decades later, the case took another bizarre turn when a diary surfaced, purportedly written by James Maybrick, claiming he was the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper. Though the diary is widely considered a hoax, it has kept the Maybrick name and its tragic story alive in the public imagination, a haunting tale of passion, poison, and prejudice. Thank you for spending this time with us. Reflecting on these past events is a way of remembering the individuals involved and the impact their stories had on their communities. If you have any thoughts on today's case, we invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. We hope you will join us again for our next true crime case.